Well, it's Tuesday afternoon, and I have a prepared text, but I'm not going to read it to you because I think you'll go to sleep. My original idea when I was imagining this, in something of a vacuum, was that I would come to the front of the room and just begin writing on the chalkboard and not say a single word to you and let you all wonder what I was doing. But I realized that without a chalkboard and with slides, you might wonder if I was doing anything or just sort of frozen. So I am beginning, and I'm going to begin by showing you the next slide. And I'd like you to wonder about it. And I'd like if you figure out what the oops, this is not moving. Well, point it at the projector. Oh, look at that. Wow, see, I'm really a technology, I'm not really a technology user, at least with any great skill, as you can see from that phantasm right there. So if anyone can tell me what is the next figure in this series, just quietly raise your hand. If you've seen the thing before, however, you're excluded. How many have seen it before? You've seen it before? You think you have the next figure? I'm going to give you one more element in the series. I have a few people who think they have it. Obey. Penny drop. Lights on. Now my main object here is not to solve this puzzle. My main object here is that I want you to notice the fact that you're wondering. I'd like you to stop and take note of the fact that you're wondering. The object that you're wondering about is this set of figures on the board. So that's the object of your wonder. But you wondering about it, you're incarnating wonder. And it's one of the wonderful things that makes you a human being, is that you incarnate wonder. And my real purpose is that you should pause for a moment and advert to the fact that as you struggle with this puzzle, you yourself are wondering. You're a principle of wonder. How many think they have it? Okay, I'll give you the next. If the projector will obey. Yes. Well, that's a great question because it's just very stylized.
No, not that one.
Oh, the first one that I added? Oh, yeah, I should not have put the line on the bottom all the way. I could have done a short line that ended there and there. That would have been better. But I wasn't thinking of that when I did it this morning. If you imagine a vertical line through the middle of each figure, the penny will probably drop. Ignore the fourth one and focus on the fifth for a second. Anyone still puzzling? I love the audible sigh of relief, of the tension of wondering. What you really should be doing, what I really want to happen, most of all, is that you just notice the fact what's happening to you when you're wondering about this. That's an experience. It's constitutive of you as a subject incarnating wonder. If you cut that in half, you'll see that it's a 5 on the right and mirrored on the left. And all the figures are that way, although I kind of made the 4 in not the most skillful way because I hadn't had any coffee when I wrote it. So you see that? Now you could produce 10. You could produce 10 of those because it depends on a conventional sign set of the integers and or the numerals rather, and then you'd have to start duplicating. Okay, so the meaning of the puzzle is perfectly clear to everybody, but I'm not so interested in the meaning of the puzzle, except that I am interested in this little detail, and that is has everybody caught it? Everybody's caught on. So each one is a mirrored integer with the integer on the right and its mirror image on the left. And once you grasp that rule, of course, you can multiply them at will. You may actually have to stop and think and make sure that you do it right and put the number on the right and the mirror image on the left and so forth. You may have to stop and think about it, but basically, the insight that grasps the rule for the construction of this series, it grounds the possibility of constructing every item in this series, every individual in this series. So that's an important thing to notice. So the first thing I want you to notice is that you're wondering. And the second thing I want you to notice is that you're wondering about something. How many picked up a piece of paper and started constructing further images to test the clues they thought they had? And how many just sort of did that in your head? How many thought maybe there was something with the heart that was maybe relevant?
I thought that was a wedding ring, the third one, right?
Yeah, the wedding ring, exactly.
Marriage, love, wedding, baby crib.
That's awesome. That's awesome. That is awesome. Well, I've gotten that before when I've shown this to students. I've gotten that sort of thing. Yeah, people, you see the heart, that looks like the way we draw a heart. And then, yeah, you get your wedding ring with your gigantic diamond. Obviously a groom with more money than I had, and I got married. I never heard a baby crib for the 4th figure before. What is that? Is that pregnant mom? So you're wondering, when you're seeing this, your wonder is relating you to the image. And I want you to notice this very important detail, and that is that wondering about the image is not the same as just seeing it. In a way, it's not even the same as looking at it. You're actively trying to figure out, because I told you, I gave you the clue, and maybe you would have begun to wonder about it anyway, but you're actively trying to figure out what is the rule here that's governing this pattern. And that's relating you to the world in a new way. You're related to the object of your wonder in a new way because you're wondering about it. And you could formulate the wonder in an explicit question. I just did formulate the wonder in the explicit question. What is the rule governing the series? But you don't have to formulate that question to have it operative in your consciousness. The question can be operative in your consciousness whether you explicitly formulate it or not. And that question is a manifestation of your capacity to wonder. That's my first point. Okay? My second point is that the wonder is relating you to an object, in this case, this schematic image that I posed. But as soon as you're wondering about it, of course, you're imagining different possibilities. Your imagination is pressed into service. Your imagination becomes the servant of your wonder, the instrument of your wonder when you're wondering about this. I mean, you could be lying on a beach and just daydreaming, or having free associations, or just go for a walk. All kinds of things may flow through your awareness. But when you're wondering about something like this, and you're actively using your imagination as the instrument of your intelligence, you're trying to construct a schematic image in which you can grasp what the rule is. Right? So the wonder relates you to an object, but your imagination comes into service, or what Aquinas calls the cogitative power. You start manipulating the image in different ways, imaginatively or with your paper, and you're turning it around to try and figure out what the rule is. Right? So you have these two things sort of playing together. Okay? Now the third thing I want to say is, we have, in this little exercise, we have two poles to notice, right? You have the object pole, which is the puzzle that you're puzzling about. And you have the subject pole, which is the incarnate wonder who's doing the puzzling, and that's you. You're the incarnate wonder that's doing the puzzling. And because you're puzzling about the object, you're apt to not really advert to the fact, to the experience of your wonder. But that experience is constitutive of you as an intelligent human being. We were talking earlier today, what is it, Jordan was talking about, what is it about us that makes us different from a machine? Well, a machine isn't doing any wondering. A machine has some rules formulated heuristically that it's working out. Somebody has to get those insights first. And the wondering is a way of being present to the world, but it's a self-presence in presence to the world. And those two meanings of presence are not the same. So let me illustrate that by distinguishing three meanings of presence for a moment. The chairs are present in the room. Your bodies are also present in the room, just as the chairs are present in the room. But the chairs are not present to one another. They're spatially present, but they're not psychologically present, we might say, or consciously present. But we're present to one another. And the chairs are present to us because we're conscious. So you may just pause for a moment and notice the fact that your bottom is pressing against this nice, new, soft Notre Dame chair, which is gold and not blue, for which I'm thankful as a representative of Boston College. It's a neutral color we share. Okay, so you're present, the chairs are present to you, they're not present to each other, we're present to one another. I'm talking, you're actively listening, you're trying to figure out if I'm going anywhere. So you're present to me, but the condition of the possibility of your being present to me, and of your being present to one another, and of your having the experience of the chair pressing upon your behind, is that you're awake and conscious. By consciousness, then, I want to name this kind of awareness that's immanent in waking experience. An awareness that's concomitant, as it were, with being awake and being present to the world. You're also, in some sense, present to yourself. Are those different meanings of presence clear? It's a little hard to get hold of. Why? Because as soon as we start to talk about our presence to ourself, we're focusing on it as an object. But by consciousness, I don't mean your presence to yourself as another object. By consciousness, I don't mean noticing yourself, adverting to yourself. We're apt to say, you walk into a party and you're very self-conscious. You feel very self-conscious. You're wondering constantly. When we say that, we mean something like, well, you're wondering, do I look, is my tie straight? Is my beard trimmed? Is it all askew out one side? Do I have food in it? I wonder about that a lot of times. Do I have food in my beard? Or did I drop something on my shirt that would make me wish I'd worn a long necktie that could conceal it? That's the way we colloquially use self-consciousness. We're focusing on ourself. You're preoccupied with yourself, but that's not what I mean. What I mean by consciousness is not noticing oneself or preoccupation with oneself. I mean the condition of the possibility of being consciously present to anything. If we were going to cut your leg off, we would put you into a deep and dreamless sleep first so that you wouldn't feel it. Because if you're awake, it hurts. And for a long time continues to hurt. So consciousness in this sense that I mean it, the self-presence of a subject in and through her presence to the world. Is that clear? Okay, now the next thing to notice, which we kind of illustrated with our little example of wondering, is that consciousness has shades or grades. It moves. It unfolds in a certain way. So there are different ways, there are different degrees in which you can be present to the world. You can be present to the world in different degrees or on different levels. You can just be daydreaming, or you can be, in the early morning. Yesterday, one of the discussions, big things here, I think it was here, in this room, I mentioned the fact that yesterday morning, not this morning, but yesterday morning, I was roused from my dogmatic slumbers because my arm had fallen asleep because of the way I was laying on it. So you have something that was awry with my organism, and it obtrudes itself up into my consciousness. And then I feel it and realize I got to move. But that's not yet asking any questions about it. That's just a thing that kind of enters or you have the fragmentary dreams of your morning, and they're not really well put together. St. Thomas says, this is only maybe St. Thomas has this experience, but he says, inevitably, when I dream and I'm doing problems of logic in my sleep, I wake up and realize I've made a mistake. That's the experience I have most mornings. I've solved all the problems in my dreams, and I wake up and realize I was mistaken. But that's kind of fragmentary. When you're in the dream, it's not really controlled or unified or directed in the same way it is when you're awake and wondering. When you're awake and wondering, there's a way in which your consciousness is under some kind of conscious control. At least you're directing it, right? You're directing your wonder to my little puzzle, or you're directing your attention to my words. And you're directing your attention to my words on the supposition that there's something meaningful in the pattern of my words, that the pattern of my words is carrying a carrier of meaning, and you'd like to grasp what it is. So you're wondering about it, and thereby directing, that's a directedness in your consciousness. And when you get an idea, for instance, the idea of the rule of this puzzle, once you get the idea, you can formulate it. You can formulate it in words. You could give some stab at formulating what the actual rule is, okay? But until you get the idea, you just have these little clues. So notice this interesting thing. You can't force yourself to get the idea, to get the insight. You can attend. You can work at the problem, but you can't make the penny drop. The penny drops when the penny drops. The lights go on when they go on, and you can't control that directly. But once the lights do go on, then you're in a different space. You have a kind of zone of conscious autonomy, or a little strip of autonomy where you can spell out the implications of what you've understood. One of the ways you could do that, of course, is by writing what you think is the next figure on your piece of paper. That's one way of spelling out the implications of what you think you've understood, eh? And one of the reasons we might do that is to check. Have I got this right or not? Because you get different ideas like the heart and the wedding ring and the crib and Dad's flask. And it turns out not all your ideas are correct. And so the answer to one question that gets worked out leads to a further question, and the further question is a little bit different from the first question. The further question is a question for judgment, for thinking about what is the evidence, or under what conditions could I say for sure that I've correctly understood the rule of this puzzle. And that question is only answered by grasping, by first of all, having a sense of what the evidence would be, and then having an understanding that the evidence, in fact, is sufficient for me to say, I've got this right. I've understood it correctly. Now, let me stop for a second and ask if there's any questions for understanding so far about what I'm saying, the distinctions that I'm making. There's some looks of pain. Let me make 3 distinctions now between data, phantasm, and evidence. 3 distinctions between data, phantasm, and evidence. By data, I just mean what's given. What's given to your experience, which is to say what's given through your senses, or what's given in your inner experience, so the experience of being a wanderer, which you normally wouldn't necessarily advert to, but I oblige you to advert to it today. It's given. And it's usually patterned. As it enters into consciousness, it's usually already patterned for us. If you're walking down the street and you're hearing all kinds of street noises, and you hear far off in the distance some music, that's easy to pick out. It's easy to pick that out, and it's relatively easy to reproduce that compared to just random street noises where there's no pattern to it, eh? Okay, but so that's the given as given. When you're thinking about a problem, though, you're construing or you're schematizing the data. You're trying to notice the elements of the given that might be relevant to the question that you're asking. So there's a further selectivity. So by the phantasm, I mean the schematic image. Earlier I called this a phantasm. It's a fancy name. It means something like a schematic image. But this isn't really the phantasm. The phantasm is in your imagination as you think about the problem, as you try and schematize it. So the woman up here said, well, how come you drew that line so long? That seems to throw me off. And sure enough, it would throw you off, because that was an error in the construction of the schematic image. But the question arises out of the fact that she's already schematizing the image. She's already disregarding aspects of it that seem irrelevant to understanding the problem. For example, the fact that the figures aren't perfectly symmetrical, or the fact that my penmanship is appalling, or the fact that I obviously didn't have the simple technology that would allow me to construct this on a tablet or something like that, because I was imagining I would have a blackboard to work with, my original conception of the thing. So you have the given as given, and then you have the given as schematized under the force of intelligence, and that's what I mean by the phantasm. But the phantasm isn't the same as the idea. Because the idea is the grasp of the rule. And the rule may be verified in this series of images, but if I said to you, please point it to me, you couldn't do it. Because the images are imaginable, but the rule is not imaginable. The rule is known intelligently or not at all, but it's not imaginable. You can't imagine, you can imagine the images in which the rule might be grasped, but the rule itself, the idea, is not imaginable. And we could multiply other examples of that. You could use a simple example like a circle. You put up a circle and say, what is it that makes this into a circle? Supposing those were better circles than in fact they are, right? And you, in order to grasp it, you'd have to, imagine the center and the radii, and grasp. If the radii are equal, it has to be round. If the radii are not equal, it cannot be round. It's necessary or impossible, depending, right? You can imagine the center and the radii, but you can't really, because the center as defined as a point. And a point is not as defined as not the point as imagined. Right? And so forth. So your grasp of the idea of a circle is a grasp of necessity and impossibility in relationships in a figure. But it's not the same as imagining the figure, and it's not the same as knowing how to use the figure or to use the name of the figure. So little kids, when they begin to learn, you teach them, oh, this is a circle, that's a circle, this is a circle. They have those little games where they have to match the figure to the hole that it can go in. They stick it in, drops in, and they go around and they pick up all kinds of things. Circle, here's another circle. You can find a lot of circles around the house. But what the child has understood is how to match a name to a shape, not the idea of a circle. The idea of a circle is what you understand in geometry. Is that clear? Now, my third term that I was going to mention is the evidence. Evidence is not the same as the data either, and that's because evidence is construed in relation to an idea that you have that's possibly relevant. The evidence is construed against a possibly relevant idea. This is why in the natural sciences you work out your hypothesis, which formulates the implications. What do you think are the implications of your idea so that you can test them? And then you can experimentally, in the natural sciences, you can experimentally generate further evidence, but the evidence is being construed in relation to the hypothesis that you have, which is the formulated implication of your idea. Okay? So it's not just the given that permits you to judge. It's evidence in relation to a possibly relevant idea. And that works one way in the natural sciences. It works a different way in relation to, say, the interpretation of a text. So think about the problem of the interpretation of the text in our line of work. So you argue, what does Aquinas really mean? You work out, well, I think he means this. Well, what's the evidence? What's the evidence that would permit me to say this is a good interpretation of Aquinas and that's a bad interpretation of Aquinas? Well, you work out the implications of your different interpretations, but you have to go back to the text and figure out what would count as evidence for or against a different interpretation. Is that clear? So evidence is working differently in relation to different kinds of questions. But it's the case that there's a kind of a structure to inquiry. So let me make this point this way. We began with the experience of the puzzle. But because you knew it was the puzzle, your experience of the puzzle wasn't mere experience, it was experience in wonder. You were looking at the puzzle with wonder. And wonder transformed your experience of the thing in a certain way. And what allowed the thing to unfold further was finally getting the insight, having the penny drop. Then you're on a new level. You're in a new zone. What promotes you is wondering. Promotes you from mere experiencing to intelligently experiencing. And once you have the idea, you can work out its implications, and that raises a further question. Have I understood this correctly? Have I understood it completely? Is my understanding adequate to the reality of the problem? So you have a further question, which is a reflective question. Under what conditions could I say this is right? And that's promoting you further because it's leading you to the point where you can say the evidence is sufficient, I can say yes, or the evidence is not sufficient, I can only say maybe, or the evidence is sufficient enough for me to say no. But when you say yes or no, you're saying yes or no to something and you're taking a stand. When we're in the seminar, you say, well, here's an idea, let's think about this idea. Let's just think about it. I'm not saying this is right, let's just think about it. Your commitment is lower when you're just working out an idea. But when you're saying, no, this idea is right. This idea is correct. Your commitment is higher. Judgment is a personal commitment. Because you're staking a claim not just on what I happen to think, but on what I know to be the case, or affirm to be the case, or hold to be the case. Brings up a problem of believing, but we'll leave that to one side for just a minute. So you have a structure. You have a structure in the process of your knowing, and the structure is a process of going beyond yourself. It begins with experience, but wonder promotes experience, and it promotes you to a higher degree of presence to the world, and the insight puts you in a new zone and raises the further question for judgment. And when you have that question, the critical spirit, it promotes you further in relation to the world. And you're asking about evidence, and when the evidence is sufficient, you can judge. And until the evidence is sufficient, you should be very cautious about your judgments, or at least tentative about them. And you can notice these things in yourself. You can practice the art of noticing when you're getting ahead of yourself. Because besides reason, careful reason, there are lots of reasons we want things to be right. We want to claim things to be right because we want to win arguments, because we don't want to have to examine previous choices that we've made in the harsh light of new discoveries, because we have political preferences or motives, or we've made a bet, or we just want to look good and impress a girl. There's lots of things that cause us to get ahead of ourselves. But when we're being our best selves in knowing, we have to be paying attention to just trying to get it right. And we have to be committed to just trying to get it right, to understand things carefully, to pay careful attention, to be carefully intelligent, to think through the implications of our ideas, and to judge them in light of the evidence and not get ahead of that. Okay, now, questions, comments, clarifications about any of that so far? What I want to suggest to you in the first instance is that, we talk a lot about ourselves as persons. And we talk about ourselves as having a certain kind of soul. But I want you to notice something that's further than that, and in some way distinct from it. And that is that because you're a person, because you have a certain kind of soul, you're a subject. You're a subject capable of attention, of intelligence, of reason. And the subject is not simply the soul. The subject is one as conscious. The subject is not simply the person. The person can be knocked unconscious, but the subject is the person as present consciously to the world and present to herself in and through that. That's what the subject is. And subjectivity unfolds. There's a process to it and there's a structure to it. And that's part of what's distinctive about us being human. And it's part of what we would have to advert to if we wanted to think about what it means that we're made to the image and likeness of God. That has something to do with the unfolding of this, of being a subject. When St. Thomas says, we're made to the image and likeness of God because we can know and love God. And when he conceives God, he conceives God as infinite knowing and loving. And he says, in the infinite knowing and loving of God, God brings forth a word, an inner word that expresses what God is, but it also expresses the value of what God is, because he says it's not just any kind of word, it's a love-breathing word that is spoken in God. And that brings us to a further question that takes us beyond the question for intelligence, for understanding, and the question for judgment. It takes us to the issue of the question for value, the moral question. Because when we know the world, we're presented with the problem of the value of the things that we know and the value of the things that might be brought about by us. So let me go into that problem by raising a couple points. First of all, we said there's a structure in our knowing process. And that structure is normative in the sense that it's the right way to know. The right way to know is asking and answering the relevant questions. I have another little slide here, if I can get the machine to listen to me. What is that? Is it? What's a pawn? Okay, so is that a pawn because it looks like a pawn? Because it's on a chessboard? If
It's like a piece from a sorry game.
it could be a piece from a sorry game. But let's suppose it's from a chess set. What makes it to be a pawn? The shape and size. So if I have a chess set at home in my living room and we've lost one of the pawns, could I use a penny? Well, wait, I'm sorry, what? Well, I got to agree with the person I'm playing with that this penny is going to be a pawn. Okay, and somebody else said something about an understanding. Who was that? What did you say?
It's an understanding of what it does. So you could put an eraser there, and it would, if you know what a pawn's supposed to do, whatever you put there would take on that
You mean, so when you say, so you understand what it does. You say, in front of you, you said pawn nest. What do you mean by pawn nest?
It takes on the characteristics of the pawn in what it's going to do.
So the pawn is the center of a set of rules,
Yes.
and and that you agree on, a set of stipulated rules that we agree on because we're in the artificial environment, the closed system of the rules of chess. Okay, so I can make a penny or a dime. Do I need a token at all? Why? Oh, it's moving through. I need a placeholder because it's moving through space and time? More space than time? You could take forever in the continuum, right? But chess is played, yes, sir?
Well, it seems like, if I understand it correctly, chess is primarily something that's conceptual and mathematical, and you're tracking the moves. So if you have a weirdly great memory,
Sure.
you could play with no pieces at all. But in real life, we need the pieces to represent keeping track of it.
But you still need an intention of where each piece is, right? Because chess is played on a grid, right? And so intrinsic to the game is some set of spatial relationships. That's not all that's intrinsic to it, but it's some set of spatial. So we have to mark the relationships by placing appropriate tokens, and we have the grid of the board. And we do have time, but it's not continuous time, right? It's ordinal, what we call ordinal time. Because chess occurs over a series of moves. You're the player, you're in continuous time, although you may go to sleep and not notice it passing, right? But the continuous time is irrelevant to the match, except if you're on a clock, in which case it's obliquely relevant, I suppose. So the pawn, you need a token, and the token you can see with your eyes, and the token is on a grid, and the grid you can see with your eyes. But the pawn is the center of a set of rules, somebody said. Well, I reformulated maybe somebody saying that. And you can't see the rules with the eyes of your head. You have to grasp them with your intelligence. If you were just watching somebody play, imagine you'd never seen this game before. You have to have a certain number of instances of pawn moves to sort of work out what the rules are. And you could work out what the rules are, and you could formulate the rule set governing pawns, and you could formalize that, right? And there might be and then if you ask the further question, have I completely understood what a pawn is? Have I completely understood all the rules that make this a pawn? You might have to be tentative in your judgment because there are rare conditions like en passant that come into effect only under certain unusual circumstances, right? So you'd need a lot of experience to say we've got this right for sure. And but then there's the other factor, and that is this doesn't have to be a pawn. The fact that it's a pawn is a contingent fact. As I've drawn a blank on your name, even though I've been sitting 2 seats from you for 2 days. Marla, as Marla pointed out, of course, it's a contingent fact that chess exists or that this is a pawn in some chess match, and that contingent fact is a function of our agreement. We've decided to bring it about, right? So, notice something. There's 3 elements that come together in our knowing that this is what a pawn is, or that this is a pawn. The token, not just the token, but our experience of the moves of the pawn, our understanding of the rules that define what a pawn is, pawnitude, pawnness. But pawnness is an abstraction that's only real in pawns. So the pawn is a composition of matter or of potency, which we agreed any suitable token could work, a penny. It's a composition of the potency and the rules, the form, the intelligibility of a pawn, and the contingent fact that we agree this shall be a pawn in this game of chess, eh? So you have three elements that are coming together to make this a pawn. The token, the potency, the intrinsic intelligibility of pawnness, and the extrinsically intelligible fact that the conditions are fulfilled. Now that'll give you a good Thomas metaphysics of potency, form, and act just by running the parallel between the steps of your knowing, the composition of the steps of your knowing, and the composition of the elements in the reality of the pawn. Okay, and it would be the same if you were thinking about any particular move that the pawn made, but the moves would be events, whereas the pawn is a kind of a thing. It's kind of a center. Now, but the question of contingency, of the fact that we notice it's just a contingent fact that the pawn is, and it's just a contingent fact that any of us are, means that there's an element to our being, an element to the being of everything in the order of the world of our experience that is only extrinsically intelligible. It only makes sense because of the fulfillment of conditions from outside itself. It only occurs or exists because of the fulfillment of conditions from outside itself. Okay, so it happens that everything that exists, every event that occurs, has this element of extrinsic intelligibility to it. It has its own intrinsic intelligibility. You can understand it as an event or as the kind of thing that it is, but the fact that it is or the fact that it occurs, that's only extrinsically intelligible. And you can work out from that to the fact that the universe is not self-explanatory. But you can also work out from that the problem of the universe having to be chosen. The universe being chosen and brought into being because it's a possible good that God chooses to realize, just as the chess match is a possible good that we choose to realize. And your freedom is not determined, it's related to different possibilities. And there are lots of possibilities that are good, and none of them are obligatory normally. There are obligatory courses of action, but normally it's not obligatory. But you can conceive different good possibilities and wonder about whether you should do them. And that, in a way, doesn't end until you choose, until you pick something. And in a way, it's the same for God. The universe, the choice of this universal order, is an exercise of God's freedom in relation to the value of this world order that's God's moral choice. Just as we make our own moral choices that are constituent to it. So beyond the question of the judgment of fact, there arises the question of judging things to be valuable, comparing them as values to one another, and choosing. And when you have to move from merely making judgments to actually making choices, of course, how you feel about things is going to be an enormous factor. Now, I said one last thing I said earlier, this structure of asking and answering questions. There's something normative about it. It's the right way. But to say that is to also make a value claim. That that's the way we should conduct ourselves. That's what it would mean to be intellectually honest, intellectually serious, intellectually virtuous. And there's lots of other questions in there, but that's a value judgment. And it invites a kind of a response, a kind of a choice to be oneself a certain way. And then you realize you're making a decision not only about things outside yourself, to play chess or to play computer or what you'll do with your time, but you're making a decision about who you'll be, who you'll become. And in making that decision and actually conducting yourself in a certain way, you're becoming more than you presently are. That's a prospective object of your deliberation and choice. To recognize that for you to be is to become. And to become is to move beyond yourself. And what moves you beyond yourself is standing by your questions and being in love. You can't give yourself wonder. It happens to you. You can't give yourself love. It happens to you. But those become the fundamental principles of your self-transcendence, of you becoming more than you presently are. And I think the invitation to be a morally serious person is to bring that into focus and realize that's a choice that we have to be continually renewing every day, to be more than presently we are. There's a lot more that I could say about these topics, but let me stop with that and ask if there are any questions, comments, objections, resentments, disappointments, frustrations, psychological baggage, sins you'd like to confess or propose for our edification. I did promise I was going to do this thing on belief, and I was thinking of using this map, but I'm not going to do it right now, unless there's a question about it. But I also said, since the custom seems to be to show a slide of your children, I told Baglow that I wouldn't omit a slide of mine. Oops, that was another part of my segment on belief. I use this for a lecture on the Trinity because there's no God Junior. But anyway, questions, comments, clarifications? Yeah, go ahead.
I've got a question. So what is the difference on your scheme between, I know subject is one of those words that's extremely tenuous, but is there a difference between a subject and a self?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm using subject to name one pole and an experience that's internally bipolar, so to speak. You could construe self to mean a lot of different things. So you could use the word self simply reflexively. So I was saying, become more than you presently are, and that's self-transcendence, going beyond yourself. And I'm not freighting self there with any particular theory of the self, just using it in a purely trying to use it in a purely reflexive way. That may not be unproblematic, but that's sort of the way I'm using it. But you could think of selfhood as, when Augustine says in the Confessions he wants to know himself, what he means is he wants to grasp the intelligibility of his life, of his story. And that intelligibility is we might say, dialectical. In other words, it's not a clean line of Augustine becoming ever more excellent. It's thank God somebody else is running the ship. So there's that self-knowledge in the sense of a kind of a narrative, my narrative selfhood over time, and the unity of that narrative, or the unity of my life, which is sort of Augustine's question for self-knowledge. And that would be a different sense than the sense in which I'm thinking about it here, but that's not irrelevant to the problem that's here. Because there's a kind of a given unity to your consciousness, unless there's something gravely wrong with you, usually kind of organically. You wake up in the morning and you have the experience of still being yourself in that reflexive sense. So there's a kind of a given unity. If there weren't a given unity, you couldn't have, when we did our opening exercise, you have the experience of the little figures that I wrote, and you have your question, and your question is about what you're seeing, and then you have your insight, which gives you an idea about what the rule is, which is an insight into an idea. And those are three different kind of elements that are going on inside of you, but they're all composing together. Why? Because there's a given unity to your consciousness. But precisely because there's a given unity, there's also this unity over time. A couple years ago, when I was a little kid, we lived in Taiwan for a while. And I hadn't been back there for like 30 years. And a couple years ago, I was invited to go back there. And you get on the ground and you suddenly smell these things that you never smelled in all those decades. Some kind of, not just foods, but detergents. I was really struck by that. Something they used to wash the sidewalks with I hadn't smelled in North America. And I didn't realize it until I was there. And then all of a sudden, it was like I was a 10-year-old kid again. I was like, wow. And, but the whole time I'm there, I'm thinking, how did I get from there to here? How did I get from this kid living in Taiwan with his parents to, I was then in Toronto, being in Toronto and so forth. And that comes out of the given unity of the consciousness, but it raises the broader question about the shape of one's life. And then when you do that kind of reflection, you realize how much of your life is basically accidental to you, that is outside your own intention. So I'm thinking, I went to university at a completely random place for ideas that must have seemed really good at the time. But I can't really exactly remember them. They were more or less fortuitous. But what was important was a teacher that I had there. One teacher. I mean, there were others, but one changed my life. Like Augustine says, not that I'm Augustine or comparable to Augustine in any way, except in sin, perhaps. But, when he says, I went to Milan to Ambrose the bishop. Well, he was going to Milan because he wanted to be close to the emperor's court, advance his career. But God was having him go to Milan for another reason. And so the unity of your life is this kind of thing that you're not really directing. You have your narrow strip of freedom. You make your little choices. I don't mean to diminish them, but our autonomy is very limited. But the way the whole thing comes together in a life is largely due to somebody else being more the author of us than we are of ourselves. But it's worth choosing to cooperate. Other questions? Yes?
Okay, so the wonder that you're talking about during
Yes.
the lecture, would it be the same wonder as like the gifts of the Holy Spirit wonder? Or are you using the word wonder and calling it something else?
Well, the gifts, when I think of the gifts, I think of that list from Isaiah, right? Wisdom, understanding, counsel, knowledge, fortitude, piety, fear of the Lord. I think wonder's connected to that. Why? What the gifts are aptitudes for docility to the prompting of the Holy Spirit. What the gifts are we talk about temperance or self-control. And we have appetites, and what self-control is, what temperance is it makes our appetites, our cravings, biddable to the judgment of our reason. How much should I eat? How much should I drink? How much should I smoke? I'm not saying I have this virtue, obviously. But it makes the lower biddable to the higher, huh? What the gifts of the Holy Spirit are is something like that. It renders the whole person biddable to the promptings of the Holy Spirit. So there's a wisdom that comes from learning, which is philosophy or theology, and maybe a wisdom that's kind of self-knowledge that I've been talking about. But the most important wisdom in us is the wisdom of being docile to the Holy Spirit and sort of seeing things in light of the movements of the Spirit in our lives. And that I do think is related to the issue of giving yourself over to wonder. Because wonder is a form of love. And when you're in Christ, every form of love in you is swept up into the highest love that's God's gift of his love. And that's personal. It links you to a person, to the Spirit who prompts you. So that the new law for us is docility to the Spirit. It's not a written law. It's not a law that's just objectifiable in precepts, except in the most general way imaginable, right? As I have done for you, so you should do for others. Take up your cross and follow me. Render not evil for evil, but a blessing instead, and so forth. But the Christian life is a life of trying to be docile to that and biddable. I always tell my students, I don't know if they believe it, if you wake up in the morning and feel like you should forgive, that's grace. You should do that. And it's related to the problem of wonder because it's a thing you can't give yourself. You're moved to it. Thank God. Other questions, comments, clarifications? I was thinking, I'd love to do this. Any map, just notice the fact that everybody recognizes these countries because everybody has seen a map. But nobody has been there and made all the measurements that map is based on. No one person in the whole world has done that. They've all shared measurements. That map is a collaborative project, and it depends on people believing each other. Making the knowledge of someone else my knowledge by accepting it on the supposition of their competence and honesty. And we do that all the time. We believe each other, and that's how we know almost everything we think we know, by trusting each other to have paid attention, carefully understood, judged in light of the evidence in a restrained and modest and honest way. That's the basis of our collaboration together. My other one is a bowl of cornflakes, which you can't see. Think sometime whenever you sit down to your bowl of cornflakes, everything that was involved in your having that bowl of cornflakes. The sowing, the watering, the reaping, the milling, the trucking, the extraction of petroleum that the trucks need to run on, that the asphalt of the roads need, that is in the rubber of their tires, the milk, the transportation of the milk, the breeding of the cows, their antibiotics. Just to have a bowl of cornflake, you are involved in a vast network of cooperation. And that cooperation depends on people trusting each other. And the possibility of our trusting each other rests in some way on our commitment ourselves, each of us, to doing it right, to getting things right, to being competent in what we do and doing it honestly. That's probably the most important thing that I want to say. And you can practice that because you notice yourself as a wanderer. And you can notice yourself as a critic. And I don't mean as a critic in the sense that you just want to have an angle so you can win. I mean as a critic because you want to get things right. And it doesn't undermine the possibility of belief because it's reasonable to believe others who know. And it would be irrational not to believe them. We'd all be living in caves guessing which berries were safe. But the basis of that is people being self-transcending, and we ourselves being self-transcending. And for my money, that means we should be less concerned about winning arguments and more concerned about trying to help people grow into this. And that would be a genuine way of being of service. But it depends on doing it ourselves, too. Any other questions, comments, clarifications? Objections, resentments, disappointments, frustrations, psychological baggage, sins. Very good. What time is the next thing?
Well, we still have some time for questions.
But I've put them into a dogmatic stupor.
That's why you're here, man. For the
Siesta.
Sister?
I have one, and maybe, I stepped out for a little bit, so I'm sorry, so if he's answered this, forgive me. Would you say humans have one consciousness that is experienced in difference of degrees, or that we can have multiple types of consciousness?
Well, I mean, I guess it would kind of depend on what you mean by the different terms. There's one subject, you. I mean, each of us is a subject. And as I was mentioning before in response to Jay's question, there's a kind of a given unity to the subject. And so in that sense, consciousness is one. But it's intermittent. You go to sleep. If you're in a deep and dreamless sleep, or if you're having your wisdom teeth taken out. In that sense, so the conscious subject is not simply identical with the person. You're a person when you're asleep. You're a person when you're unconscious. You're a person when you're in the womb developing the brainstem and so forth. But you're a subject only when you're under certain conditions. But the unity of the subject is given in consciousness normally. You could have profound amnesia. There are those things, right? But normally it's given. In that sense, consciousness is one. And it's a flow. And it's a polyphony. There's a lot of different stuff going on in there. Go walk around the lake, pray your rosary. Part of you's praying your rosary, but you're still watching where you're going. Maybe noticing a deer, maybe wondering about something that you read. You have to keep coming back. There's a polyphony. And there's a flow in the sense that one thing leads to another. And the flow can be directed. You can direct the flow like you did when I gave you the exercise of wondering. And the direction yields a structure, so there can be a structure in the flow. And that is to say, you're consciously related to the world. You're consciously related to the world as a potential infinity. I mean, wonder and love are open-ended. They're not like sensation, which is restricted to a particular genus of objects. You can wonder about everything, and you can love it. But it unfolds in a structure. Questions unfold in a structured way. Certain kinds of questions lead to others. And as you follow the root of them, you're displacing yourself into the real world. Not simply the world of possibility, but the world of actuality. Not simply the world of actuality, but the world of what's valuable. What's valuable in what is, and what's valuable in what might be if you were to fulfill certain conditions by your own activities and so forth. So there's a structure of self-displacement, and I think you could think of it as enlargements or intensifications, both, right? And sin is contraction. what sin is contraction. It's refusing to ask the question, or refusing to judge in light of the evidence, or refusing to act in a responsible way despite knowing what ought to or ought not to be done, or anything like that. Any kind of contraction is what sin is. So it's essentially negative. Does that answer your question? So there's a lot of different pieces. There's a unity that's given in the subject, but in the object pole, it's a flow. And so there's movement, and the subject is related to the objects in different ways. Yeah, go ahead.
Since you're talking about the self and unity of consciousness and your experience of yourself and all this kind of stuff, it's started to make me wonder about neuroscience.
Yeah.
And whether it's troublesome to you at all, or to any of the issues you're raising here, that neuroscience increasingly is telling us that the self is pretty much an illusion, and there's really nowhere in the brain where we can identify this unity of consciousness, that it's all very much a fragmented and parallel, chaotic mess in there. Does that raise any problems or obstacles for how you're describing it?
Well, I mean, I think it raises questions. It raises a lot of questions about things that I don't understand. But first of all, if you believe in hylomorphism, it's not surprising that the stuff is going on consciously is matched with stuff that's going on in your organism. But the second thing is, when I did the little example with the pawn, and we said, okay, you have a token, but then you have the intelligibility of the pawn, and the intelligibility of the pawn is not imaginable. It may be formalizable in some set of rules, but it's not per se imaginable. So it's not simply reducible to what's intrinsically conditioned by space and time, probably. Well, I should say that somewhat differently. Let me retract that statement. Let me do this a different way. So, it doesn't seem surprising to me. I don't know actually that much about the neuroscience, so I have to give a limited answer to your question. It doesn't seem surprising to me there's a reductive tendency to want to say what's going on in consciousness is epiphenomenal, and what's really going on is what's going on in the brain, right? But that doesn't seem to me to be adequate at all, and in that sense I don't worry about it. And the reason is there is a given unity to consciousness. You experience it as given, and actually it's important that you experience it as given, because if there weren't any kind of given unity to consciousness, you couldn't construe the temporal succession of the sounds coming from me into a single meaning. But your ability to do that construal is conscious. There may be other things. You're not doing it in a disembodied way. There's all kinds of synapses firing, right? But you're consciously directing yourself to my words. That's a part of your experience. And I just fail to see what the reason is to suppose that wondering is epiphenomenal and that the real stuff is just what's going down underneath, right? I mean, you could measure all the longitudinal waves in the air very carefully. You wouldn't understand what I'm talking about. That doesn't give you what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is constituted by meanings, and meanings are in a world that's conscious. So I'll have to think a little bit more. What I wanted to do with the example of the pawn was really make an argument a kind of an argument against reductionism. I mean, materialism is just the supposition that the pawn is adequately reducible to the token or to the space and time, to those, and I think that that's not correct. I think if you carefully think through actually what a pawn is, you realize, okay, there's not only the time and the space and so forth, but the intelligibility of the rules and the contingent fact and so forth. So you have a composite reality that isn't simply reducible to the material. It is the case, however, that pawns are not intelligent, and we are intelligent. So we're not only intelligible in the sense of being possibly understood, but we're intelligent in the sense of being potential understanders. And that, I think, is even less reducible, it seems to me. And I would have more confidence in the pronouncement of the neuroscientists if I felt clear that they knew what they were talking about in relation to consciousness. I mean, in other words, it's easy to pronounce judgment on questions that you haven't understood. And it's not super clear to me for instance, if you wanted to compare the kind of knowing that your dog does to the kind of knowing that we do, or any other kind of comparison like that, you'd have to have a lot of things clear, a lot of different kinds of understanding of the different kinds of things that we're doing when we're knowing. And I've just never read anything in that zone that persuaded me that the comparison was being done by someone who really had a clear insight about what an insight is. Usually, what's really obvious in us, in our knowing, is looking and different kinds of logical processes. But the logical processes depend upon premises, and the premises are all inferred, are all from insights. And so there's a non-logical component that's going on. It's only after that's occurred that you can formalize the thing into some kind of system. And but those formalizations are much more obvious to us for lots and lots of reasons. I mean, one is a late medieval preoccupation with logic. But I mean, especially now that we're doing all these kinds of things with artificial intelligence, where we have these, but it seems like it has to be a closed system, and intelligence is not a closed system because there are non-logical events as well as logical. I don't mean illogical, but non-logical. Any other questions? Jay?
I've got a very quick one. I was thinking about you've spoken about intelligibility, and I was thinking about the difference that might be helpful to unpack between intelligibility and cognizability. And I remember in Lonergan's method, where I think it's there, he makes the claim that God as such is perfectly intelligible, but not cognizable. Or at least the dictates of whatever we do in theology, we need to be.
Yeah.
So anyway, if you have that distinction, how does the question of intelligibility, how should that maybe inform the goals of our pedagogy? How do we teach towards intelligibility, or how do we communicate the intelligibility, rather than just the sort of more forensic standard of cognizability?
Could you explain the difference a little bit?
So I'm asking him to do that. But
Yeah, but I mean,
so
what is
in terms-
cognized, but how is that different from intelligence? Could you explain?
Yeah, so understanding and then being known.
Oh, I see.
Yeah?
Yeah. Well, Jeremy can probably, what does Lonergan mean with that distinction?
for those of you who don't know, Jeremy is one of the foremost interpreters of Lonergan, period, and his recent book is the best book on Lonergan out there, so read it. But here we go.
No,
No pressure, though. No pressure.
the thing is, God is, earlier I mentioned the fact that every event that occurs and everything that exists in the universe of our experience has an element to it that's only extrinsically intelligible. It's conditional. It occurs on the fulfillment of certain conditions, or it exists because of the fulfillment of certain conditions. And that means it's not completely self-explanatory. It has a kind of an intrinsic intelligibility, but it exists or occurs only on the fulfillment of conditions beyond itself. And that's true for the whole order of the universe. It's not a self-explanatory order. Now, the reason I mention this, the reason this is related to Jay's question, is because you have to conceive that problem in order to conceive what we would mean by God. By God, God is, let's say, if I may be permitted to put it this way, and it's not out of irreverence, it's just out of wanting to have a certain order of the development of ideas here. So, by God, we mean hypothetically what is completely self-explanatory being that is unconditioned in every way, absolutely unconditioned being. So God is self-explanatory and capable of explaining everything else. That's what we mean by God, let's say in a philosophic context. Religiously, of course, we mean by God the object of absolute love. But philosophically, let's say, by God, we mean absolute unconditioned being, okay, and capable of explaining itself and of everything else, which means God is not a datum to be explained. God is an explanation. That is, God is the complete and sufficient, all-sufficient explanation of all that is and all that occurs, okay? And God so conceived is either necessary or impossible. Because if God exists apart from any conditions and therefore necessarily. And if God does not exist, no conditions could be fulfilled that would bring God so conceived into existence, right? So God is either necessary or impossible. And if we stand by our reason, if we stand by our intelligence, our requirement for explanations for things, we can't affirm that the universe exists, the order of the universe exists simply as a brute fact for which no reason is given. That is, in every other domain of our lives, we're devoted to discovering reasons. If you said to the fire marshal, the fire occurred with no cause whatever, that doesn't work. A rational person doesn't accept an explanation like that because a rational person demands a reason. And so if we query the demand for reason in relation to the contingent order of the universe or any possible universe, which any possible universe is conditional order, then we have to affirm the existence of God. Now, here's the point that I want to finally come to land this baby. And that is, if we conceive God as all-sufficient explanation, self-explanatory being, then obviously we don't understand what God is. Because if you understood what God was, you would understand everything. If you understood God, you would understand everything, because God is the understanding of everything. God is the explanation of everything. And obviously, we don't possess the explanation of everything. But we know we can rationally affirm that such an explanation exists, that there is God. So God in our knowledge is one thing. We know that there is God, We know God is absolutely unconditioned. We know God is self-explanatory and explanatory of all else. But we don't understand God. So there's a difference between God and our knowledge and God and our understanding, or God and our thinking. How do we understand God? We understand God only by extrapolating. We know what understanding is in relation to limited things, objects that we understand, finite objects of understanding. And we extrapolate from that to conceive God as infinite understanding of everything about everything, all at once. We know what sufficient evidence is in limited conditions, and we extrapolate from that to conceive God as all sufficient, with no extrinsic conditions to be fulfilled, but completely self-explanatory. We know what value is in particular instances. This value, that value, the value of my children, the value of the person I might become, the value of taking a job, the value of my apostolate, the value of my students. And we extrapolate from that to conceive God as absolute value and the ground of all other value. Everything is valuable in its own mode and measure, but insofar as it participates in a universal order that mirrors forth the glory and goodness of God. Now, we know all those things to be true, but we don't know that universal order. And still less do we understand. We don't know in the sense of understand that universal order, and we don't know and understand God in that sense. We only know God in a kind of negative way. We postulate the fact, the existence of God. We can say that God is infinite understanding, but what infinite understanding is beyond our understanding. What infinite all-sufficiency is beyond our knowledge. What infinite value is beyond our understanding. So there's that kind of disjunction. But incidentally, I mentioned this collaboration of believing. We believe each other all the time. We take each other's word for it. And it's not because we're going to go check for ourselves. You're looking at that map of Brazil. Everybody recognizes the map of Brazil. Everybody trusts the map of Brazil. And you would be an irrational fool not to trust the map of Brazil. And not one of you has any inclination, not one of you has any capacity to go and personally verify that. You'd spend the rest of your life with surveyor's tools walking across the Amazon. The rationality of your believing does not depend upon your ability to personally verify it. It depends upon the reasonableness of trusting someone who is competent and honest. And you take your own share in that collaboration by being competent and honest yourself. I traveled a little bit far from the question. So I just was making the distinction between God and our knowledge and God and our understanding. And then I moved to a distinction between what we know through believing, which is accepting what others have discovered, and what we know through our own personal discovery. But we could just add one further distinction, which I alluded to earlier, and that is between what we know in the fully rational sense of understanding something and judging it to be true, or at least judging it to be true on the basis of deciding to trust somebody else, though we don't ourselves understand it. That's different from knowing just in the sense of sense experience. In the sense of sense experience, everybody knows what a tree is, everybody knows who I am in this room. But in the sense of understanding me, either in the sense of understanding the kind of thing that I am, a human thing, or understanding the unity of my life, none of you know me, nor do I know myself. You have a kind of a sensitive habit that associates the name with the figure and the voice of Wilkins, which is useful. But it's not knowledge of me in the fully and properly human sense. And that's a little bit strange to think about. You're going to go out into the courtyard out there and look at all those trees and think to yourself, maybe for the first time, by God, I don't know what a tree is. To know what a tree is the thing that botany is moving towards. It's what the botanist is trying to figure out. It's the nature of the tree, but as an unknown X. And to know the nature of a human being, well, you have a very complicated nature. You'd have to grasp all the principles of your development on all the different levels of your development. Your organism, your psyche and sensorium and emotional life, your intellectual and moral life, all those principles of your development and how they're integrated together in the thing we mean by human nature, which is the remote principle in you of your development and integration as a being over time that would be grasped and verified by grasping and verifying all the proximate operators of your development on the different, across the different levels of your development or different genera, explanatory genera. It's one thing to develop organically, another to develop in your sensorium and your psyche and so forth, and another to develop intellectually and morally. Only the last is open-ended, by the way, completely open-ended. It's in the last that you're a potential infinity. You could grow forever. But that won't happen, because what will happen is you'll die, and then you'll see God face to face, and your mind will be made perfect, or at least as perfect as it's ever going to be. Okay, I got to stop.
All right.
The man with the hook is back there saying, land.
I always love it every moment, but
Thank you.